Moving on here to another place where there's, well, some certainty, some uncertainty, and that is West Asia, so-called Middle East, quote unquote, where it seems like there's at least a possibility of a deepening conflict, regional conflict. There's already a regional conflict, but one that could get worse and spiral to a greater degree. And we are very, very honored to be joined here once again by Brian Becker, who, among many other things, is the host of the Socialist Program that airs here Wednesday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you really care about what's going on in Gaza, by the way, I really, really highly suggest you watch last night's episode with some important insight from those you will never hear from the mainstream media. But Brian, thanks so much for being back with us.
Great to be with you.
Well, I guess my first question here is maybe how are you reading the situation? I mean, obviously there is a lot of talk in the air that the United States or Israel or some combination of them may directly strike Iran. There could be a deepening conflict there. Whatever the U.S. may or may not do in in Iraq. So, I mean, does it seem to you like we're sort of dominoes are falling, so to speak, to sort of another Middle Eastern morass, or is that perhaps maybe a little bit overdrawn?
Well, I think the Biden administration is concerned about a regional war, concerned about a deepening and widening war. I think they're trying to prevent that from happening because the U.S. will lose the war, so will Israel. And there's a recognition that while Netanyahu may want to widen and prolong the war in Gaza into a regional conflict, because at least that way he can remain in office rather than remaining in jail. It's not really in the interest of the United States to have a larger war in the Middle East. Let's not forget that President Obama in 2011 said the U.S. must pivot to Asia. Why? Because the U.S. had been bogged down in losing wars in the Middle East, succeeding in killing a lot of people, but not winning the war. Meanwhile, China peacefully, accelerated its own development because the U.S. was bogged down somewhere else. So here we are, 13 years after President Obama's pivot to Asia, and the U.S. is bogged down again in a war in the Middle East. Netanyahu and Biden are tied at the hip. Both of you saw that the U.S. soldiers, 3 of them were killed by a drone strike in a military base in Jordan. I, for one, did not know that there was a military base in Jordan. I mean, there are U.S. military bases everywhere around the Middle East. But this is apparently the base where the U.S. has been conducting the Syria invasion, which has been going on for almost a decade now by the United States. U.S. troops are still illegally in Syria. So there's already a low-intensity regional war. Iran just announced that if the U.S. strikes Iran, which the Biden administration was suggesting it might, that Iran is completely ready to hit back. And just let's also remember, Rania mentioned with your last guest about how much has changed in the last year. Well, 4 years ago, General Soleimani, the Iranian military leader, was assassinated at Baghdad airport on orders of Donald Trump. And the Iranians struck back at U.S. military bases. More than 20 U.S. military bases were hit in Iraq. The Iranians said, we're having a measured response, but if you want to go for it, we're ready. And what did Trump do? What did the U.S. do? They did not retaliate a second time because they knew they would lose a regional war. So the U.S. is on the horns of a dilemma, completely with Israel in its catastrophic genocidal war against Gaza, completely with Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to prolong and widen the war. The U.S. can't escape that embrace because it did it itself. Biden did it himself. And yet a wider regional war will be a complete and utter disaster for U.S. imperialism. Again, a disaster for the people of the region, but I think a bigger failure for the United States should it, in fact, happen.
Brian, it is quite interesting. All this time, the U.S. it's had a contradictory mission. On the one hand, it's like, yes, Israel, go all the way, dismantle Hamas. We totally agree. We're, a little upset with maybe how far you've gone in doing it or how you've been a little embarrassing and bombing hospitals, but overall we'll defend it. The attitude is they have to take out Hamas in Gaza. However, at the same time, you have all of these groups that are a part of the resistance axis repeatedly making it very clear, if you want this like tit for tat between us and the US and us and Israel, whether we're talking about Hezbollah, whether we're talking about Ansar Allah in Yemen, whether we're talking about the various Iraqi groups that are hitting US bases, including the one that hit the base we had no idea existed in Jordan. They've all repeated the same things over and over again. If you want this to stop the genocide in Gaza. That is what will prevent this from escalating regionally. The US has this ridiculous idea that there can continue to be a genocide in Gaza and they can just contain it there and somehow restrain it from, expanding across the rest of the region. But what I do think is interesting here with this contradiction is that the Biden administration has now leaked to the media today that they do plan to hit Iranian targets across Syria and Iraq for several days. But when they leak that ahead of time, to me, it suggests that they're trying to alert the Iranians to try to limit the casualties from their response. Which is kind of something similar that they did with the Yemenis when they first bombed. I guess I'm just curious, like how do you explain those contradictory ideas? On the one hand, you want Israel to dismantle Hamas. You keep giving Israel more time. You keep giving Israel all the weapons in the world because you need Israel to have some kind of victory. But on the other hand, it's completely catastrophic for a U.S. empire to have this expansion of the war across the Middle East, which is inevitable if this genocide in Gaza continues.
Yeah, no, those are really excellent points, Rania. And it's kind of the logic of empire is playing itself out here. And the logic of empire has inside of it a fundamental contradiction. The logic of empire is if the empire is hit, then they must carry out vengeance. They must show that they're the boss. They must show that they're not weak. They can't even accept neutrality. Neutrality is considered an act of conspiracy, in fact. So the logic of empire means that the empire must respond. So if U.S. soldiers are killed in killed in Jordan, then the U.S. must strike back. If the Houthis or the Yemeni people disrupt shipping to Israel, even if no one is killed, the U.S. considers it a blow against empire. If Hamas successfully bridges the wall on October 7th, it's considered an attack against the empire. Like the U.S. considers Israel to be an asset. It considers the shipping in the Red Sea to be its asset. It considers the military bases in the north of Jordan to be its asset. So whenever it is struck, the logic of empire requires vengeance, requires revenge, requires even disproportional response. And yet, to the extent that the empire does do these things, it sinks deeper and deeper into the quicksand of a war that it can't actually win. And why? Because the people of the Middle East, not the governments are mostly client states, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, largely client states. But the masses of people, hundreds of millions of Arab people or Iranian people or other peoples who inhabit the Middle East, have an anti-imperialist consciousness, and they're going to keep fighting. They're going to keep resisting. And the fact that the U.S. or Israel has military supremacy and can impose so many deaths on the other side, it doesn't change the consciousness of the people. In fact, it becomes a detonator, an accelerant for that consciousness to grow. So there's the contradiction. The empire must act the way empires do, and yet every act triggers more resistance, not from governments, but from people. So this is an epic battle between the people of the region who want to be free of colonialism, domination, Zionism, imperialism, racism, apartheid, and those who perpetuate it. So that's why, in a way, all of it, whether it's in Yemen with the so-called Houthis or whether it's in Syria with the Syrian government or the Hezbollah in Lebanon or Islamic resistance in Iraq, these are different iterations, philosophical, ideological, or religious iterations of the same thing, which is the yearning of the people to be free people and to not live under the domination of empire. So this is the paradox, the horns of the dilemma that empire is on right now, and I don't think it can escape.
I think this is a good question, and maybe in some ways to many it feels obvious, but I think it deserves saying is why is this region of the world so important to them? Because I think many people would say, well, if China's the bigger issue, why don't they just leave anyway? Like, why do they need to stay there?
Yeah, and in fact, this policy actually doesn't make sense from the point of view of empire. I mean, Obama was trying to have this kind of geostrategic thinking about let's pivot away from endless conflict in the Middle East. That's when he started the Iran nuclear arms talks. He was trying to have some level of normalization with Iran. So there's a sort of intelligence, a geostrategic intelligence that tells US policymakers, don't keep doing the same thing. Do something different, because in fact, this is a losing battle. But I think the real problem for them is the reflex of empire. The reflex of empire is if you are hit, if you are attacked, you must show that you will not be pushed around. You won't be a diminishing influence. You won't be a weakening empire. So the reflex is what keeps America doing things that are obviously stupid from the point of view of empire. Not only they're immoral, unethical, genocidal, etc., they're stupid, they're dumb, they don't make sense. They're a self-inflicted wound, but they can't do it because it's kind of like the mafia. If you defy the mafia in your neighborhood and they don't come and shoot you, or they don't come and break your legs, then other people in the neighborhood think that they can defy the mafia. So it's the reflex of the empire, or the reflex of the 700-pound gorilla, those who exercise sort of unrestricted, undiluted power. Once they get challenged, once the bully is challenged and has a bloody nose, it's the end, basically. And so the Arab people, the people in the Middle East, generally speaking, are fighting back. Like, who would have thought on October 7th that the whole world would be changed as Rania has described the last 4 months? But it did change. And why did it change? It wasn't because Hamas was able to turn off the electricity in Israel, detonate neighborhoods, turn off the water, destroy whole areas. All of that has happened to the Palestinians in Gaza. All the people in Gaza did was they showed they were going to resist. And for 8 hours, they controlled, 8 hours, that's all it was. They controlled a part of historic Palestine across that border that was intentionally demolished in 1948 by Order Number 40 by the Israeli command. You can check the Israeli archives for that. For 8 hours, Palestinian people were in that neighborhood. And because of that, the empire says, no, we're going to go along with a genocidal campaign by a fascist government in Tel Aviv, because we preferred that over the idea that you can hit us and succeed. We must punish you, even if it means genocide and our association with genocide. We prefer that. This is the logic of empire, and why this empire will ultimately lose.
Yeah. I mean, it really is amazing how much has to, I feel like there's it's like before and after Christ, before and after October 7th. Like, that's kind of how the world feels right now. And so I'm curious to elaborate on the point you were making. Given everything you've said, I mean, I know what we can do here is speculate. We can't really predict anything, but we do have an emerging multipolar world, as we've talked about on this show many times. And I think you've always said, Brian, that polarity itself doesn't necessarily mean the world suddenly gets better, but it does give space to the global South that maybe it didn't have before in certain aspects. So I'm curious, how does post October 7th, when you have the entire order of the global North, the rules-based order, I mean, it's been completely, made into a mockery. Like, does it even exist anymore after this? Does international law exist after this? Does the U.S. even get to try to weaponize human rights like it did before? I'm not sure they can, after what the world has watched take place in Israel. So how can you put that, I guess, can you put that in the context of what it means in an emerging multipolar world to have a moment like this when the mask is completely off for the imperialist countries?
Well, I mean, if you think about it in a serious way, the multipolarity, which I think people are hoping will be a check on empire, a restraint on empire, that there will be other power centers. In some ways, that has not happened. What you see is that Russia and China have divergent interests with the United States, as does Iran, for instance. But they're not really a major factor right now. I mean, it's really the Yemenis and people in Lebanon whose acts of resistance are of some material aid to the people in Gaza. So you see Russia and China, they're saying words that are opposing the Israeli genocide, but they're not doing that much. They're actually worried about the war in the Middle East drawing them in which case it becomes a global conflict. Yes, they all said they gave a thumbs up to the South Africa genocide case at the ICJ. That was a sign of the multipolarity, that you had these two worlds, all of the global north, NATO powers saying no to South Africa, and all the countries of the global south saying yes to South Africa's case. But again, that's a legal matter. I think when I'm trying to summarize what's gone on since October 7th, I go back to this idea that it's the people themselves. It's the people of the region. It's the people of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and of course the Palestinian people first and foremost, who are really changing the equation. On October 6th, Israel was about to be embraced by the reactionary regimes of the Middle East, and its rule, it's already completely oppressive rule, was going to be sort of normalized. That's off the table right now. What put it off the table? It really wasn't other state actors. It wasn't Russia or China or Iran that interfered. It was the resistance of the Palestinian people themselves. And so that element of the historical process is the thing that I think should be emphasized at the moment, is the anti-colonial consciousness of the masses is in fact this other power. When we think of multipolarity, we think about the varying powers between the states. When I think about what's happened since October 7th, I see a global movement, grassroots movement of opposition, protest, dissent, resistance that has sprung up. In a way, it demonstrates in a nascent way the power of the people. It's kind of another power. It's not a state actor. It's not organized into one single group, but it is a power, and it is having an impact and has to be factored into the calculations of policymakers, even in some of the biggest, most powerful imperial countries.
Mm-hmm. Brian Becker, host of the Socialist Program that airs right here on Breakthrough News, the video version at least, at 7 o'clock on Wednesdays. That's Eastern Time. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.